Gary Willett, and I'm sitting here with the greatest magician of this or any other time. He was born in Canada on June 11th, 1894. He bore the name David Frederick Wingfield Verner, though he later went on to become known as Dai Vernon, and still later, the Professor. 3 changes of name in one lifetime, Professor. How did that come about?
Well, you know, it's a funny thing that I had an ambition as a child, a small boy. When I first started to read novels, I used to read a lot of stories, and I used to read about New York City and the famous rectors and the different establishments of the theaters and the opera, the ballet, and I thought, what a wonderful place New York must be, because I lived in Ottawa, Canada, and we had theaters there and everything, but not as plentiful as in New York. And I thought, what a wonderful place New York must be. So my ambition was to live in New York. So later on, years later, when I was 21 years of age, I was in the Royal Canadian Air Force during the First World War. And I thought, gee, so I got permission, leave, to go visit New York. And I went down to New York in uniform. And I became rather disgusted because with the name Verner, nobody could say Verner. They'd say Voynoi and Weiner and everything else because, you know, so they used to have a joke about little Goitie sitting on the coib reading the Wild. Because they can't say they can't say it, or give it an sound. So they couldn't say Verner. That was every place I'd go, they'd say, what's your name? And I'd tell them, and they'd say, oh, Voynoi, and I got disgusted. So at that time, Irene and Vernon Castle, the famous dance team that started the ballroom dancing craze, they were very popular in New York, and everybody, for some reason or other, they learned to say Vernon Castle, Vernon. So I thought, oh, I'll change Verner to Vernon. So I changed my name to Vernon instead of Verner. That's the way I changed my name. And then the Dai part was a different thing. The D-A-I was another funny thing because I didn't choose that Dai at all. They used to, in Canada, they called me Dai Vernon, Dai Verner. And when I was younger, I won several competitions in diving, fancy diving from a 3-meter board. And one day in the Ottawa Evening Journal, I won the city championship diving, and they had my name in big letters across the front page, Dai Vernon, Verner, Dai Verner. And all the boys at school, they said, what's this business, Dai? They didn't say Dai. What is it, day or die? And I used to say either or either because I didn't know how it was pronounced. I didn't know what it meant or anything. Then I heard in Welsh that the name David, the nickname is Dai, just like Ted for Edward and so on. There was a nickname for the name David. So I said, well, I'll keep that name. So I kept it in all the boys at school. And now, in a later day, they asked me, where did that name come from? I said, well, my real name is David, D-A-V-I-D. But I said, the V-D, I didn't like it, and I took it out, so that just left D-A-I. And so that's a better retort than saying either or either. I made a rather long story of it, but this is the absolute truth.
But everybody I've ever met has always called you the Professor.
Well, that was given to me by a very wonderful corporation lawyer in New York named Garrick Spencer. Incidentally, his grandmother started the Red Cross movement on the world. I mean, she was one of the pioneers in the Red Cross. He was a very brilliant man, and he said, I'm going to call you the Professor because he said, you seem to be academic, you know all these answers to magical problems, and he said, I think you should be the Professor. And it kind of caught on, and as I got older, it's more appropriate because everybody considers a professor to be an old character, an old codger of some kind, because a young fellow called a professor is kind of ridiculous if you see a very young boy called a professor, but as you get older, the name is appropriate. So I don't care for it because they call a lot of eccentric people professors. I mean, eccentric characters, they call them the professors.
Well, we know it means learned. But tell me, Professor, let's go back to Ottawa. Young David is a young boy, and somehow he gets the magic bug.
Yes, well, ever since, you know, when I was a small boy, my father used to do a simple little trick of putting chalk marks through a table, apparently, a red and a green and a blue chalk mark, and he apparently passed them through the table. But I caught on to this trick with my father when I was quite a young boy, probably 4 or 5 years old. So then I started to be interested in these things that mystified people, And some boy at school showed me a trick with a piece of string, a loop of string. So I learned to do that. My father showed me how to put a string through your buttonhole and put your thumbs in it, cross your fingers and pull it, and it would come out of the buttonhole, and that was a second trick. And then I learned how to apparently tie knots in a piece of string by putting the string in your mouth and wiggling your tongue around. You pull it out. Of course, it was a fake. You didn't really tie the knots with your tongue, but you switched a piece of thread with knots in it for a plain piece of thread. And that was the third one, and I went on and on. Then I got big loops of string, small loops of string, and heavy string and light string. And by the time I was about 6 years old, or 7, I knew 52 different tricks with a piece of string. How to tie your thumbs together with a string, how to put it in and out your fingers and pull it loose, how to put it on somebody else's finger and take it off, and all these things. So anyway, I knew there were 52 cards in a pack, and I had about 50 string tricks, and I thought, I got to get 2 more to have 1 for every card in the pack. As a little boy, I thought that. I finally got to 52 string tricks. And then from then on, I started reading magazines, a Boy's Own Paper and Chum's magazine, two magazines that had things for boys. And every now and again, they'd tell about some trick in there. And the old Strand magazine, which later became the Westminster magazine, Strand magazine every month used to have a chapter or a few pages explaining tricks done by the racehorse gamblers on the racetrack. And as a little boy, I remember the Strand magazine, we subscribed to that magazine. It used to come to the house every month, a copy. And oh, I waited just feverishly for that magazine to arrive, because it would always have a page or 2 explaining tricks. And I never forget the first time I heard the term thimble rig. Well, I thought, what is thimble rig? That's a funny name. And that was the derivation of the old shell game, which everybody knows, the 3-shell game, which is performed with 3 walnut shells and a pea. But the old-timers used to use 3 silver thimbles and a pea, and a real pea, not a rubber pea like they do in 3 silver thimbles.
This was a betting game.
Yeah, the betting game. And very few people today, I don't think there are 2 people probably in the world that know anything about thimble rig, because it's an entirely different method from the walnut shells, which you can teach anybody in a few minutes because it's almost automatic. You don't have to be skillful at sleight of hand. But thimble rig is highly, dependent upon clever sleight of hand. And that's where they used to make the money at the race courses, with thimble rig and the English purse trick, which involves the purse palm, which I explained before to you, about the purse palm.
Right.
But these were the 2 big gambling games at the race course. Now, the reason they used to always go to a racetrack, because all the wealthy people, royalty and the famous people, would go to the races.
In a betting mood.
Sport of kings, yes. And they always had plenty of money to bet and everything. And some of the big winners would win probably hundreds of dollars. And they were wonderful suckers, because they knew nothing about finding a pea under a thimble, but they perhaps picked a lucky horse at 20 to 1 odds, but when it came to finding a little pea under a thimble, they were just as dumb as anybody else, and they bet large money. And of course, these thimble riggers would see that they got involved in the game, and that's why they did that at racetracks.